In the depths of a military base kitchen, surrounded by the clatter of pots and the steam of industrial dishwashers, nobody expected that the quiet woman peeling potatoes would become the most talked-about legend among Navy SEALs. Sarah Chun had spent months scrubbing floors and serving meals, invisible to the elite warriors who passed through her workplace daily. But when chaos erupted and lives hung in the balance, this unassuming kitchen worker would reveal skills that would leave hardened Special Forces operators speechless and create a story they would carry with them forever. What happened in those crucial seconds would challenge everything these battle-tested soldiers thought they knew about courage, skill, and the extraordinary people hiding in plain sight. This is the true story of how an ordinary woman became an unforgettable part of SEAL team history, and why her actions that day would be whispered about in military circles for years to come. Sarah Chun wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her sleeve as she finished loading another rack of dishes into the industrial dishwasher. The Naval Special Warfare Command Base kitchen was a world unto itself, hidden beneath layers of concrete and steel, where the clash of plates competed with the distant rumble of aircraft overhead. For 8 months, she had been part of the invisible workforce that kept the elite military machine running, one meal at a time. At 28, Sarah had taken the kitchen position out of necessity rather than choice. After her father's medical bills had drained the family savings and her younger brother needed money for college, she had applied for any job that offered steady pay and benefits. The military contractor position seemed perfect, offering decent wages and the kind of anonymity she preferred. She had always been the type to blend into the background, content to observe rather than be observed. The SEALs who passed through her serving line barely acknowledged her existence. To them, she was just another face behind the steam trays, someone who ladled out portions and kept their coffee cups filled. They would joke loudly among themselves, sharing stories of missions and training exercises while she worked silently in the background. Sarah had learned to tune out most conversations, but she found herself naturally absorbing details about their world without even trying. What none of them knew was that Sarah carried secrets of her own. Growing up in rural Montana, she had learned to shoot from her grandfather, a Korean War veteran who believed that every member of the family should know how to handle firearms safely. By the age of 12, she could hit a tin can at 50 yards with iron sights. By 16, she was out hooding most of the adults at the local gun club. Her grandfather had called her a natural, but after he passed away when she was 18, she had put the guns away and focused on her studies. College had been a brief experiment in normalcy. Sarah had studied business administration, thinking it would lead to a stable office job, but she had always felt out of place among her peers. While they worried about social media and weekend parties, she found herself drawn to documentaries about military history and precision shooting competitions that she watched alone in her dorm room. She had graduated with decent grades, but no real direction, taking a series of temporary jobs that paid the bills, but never engaged her. The kitchen job at the naval base had been different from the start. There was something about the discipline and purpose that surrounded her that felt familiar, even comforting. The SEALs moved with a confidence she recognized from her grandfather's generation, men who had seen real action and carried themselves with quiet authority. She respected their dedication, even if they barely noticed her existence. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison was different from most of the others who came through her line. Where many of the younger SEALs were loud and boisterous, Morrison carried himself with the kind of calm assurance that came from years of experience. He was in his late 30s, with gray beginning to show at his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many missions in too many dangerous places. Unlike his teammates, he always acknowledged Sarah with a nod and a quiet thank you when she served his meals. Morrison commanded Alpha Team, one of the most experienced units on the base. His men respected him not just for his rank, but for his judgment under pressure. He had led dozens of successful missions across multiple theaters, earning decorations that he never talked about, and scars that told stories he would never share with civilians. But there was something about the quiet kitchen worker that intrigued him, though he could not quite put his finger on what it was. Sarah had begun to notice patterns in the base's rhythm. She knew when teams were preparing for deployment by the increased tension in the dining area and the way conversations became more focused. She could tell which missions were classified by how quickly conversations stopped when officers entered the room. She observed everything while appearing to notice nothing, a skill that had served her well throughout her life. The base itself was a marvel of military engineering, built to house and train the Navy's most elite warriors. Underground facilities connected through a network of tunnels that most civilian contractors never saw. The kitchen where Sarah worked was strategically located to serve multiple training areas and briefing rooms, making it a natural gathering point for operators between exercises. On this particular Tuesday morning, Sarah arrived for her shift to find the kitchen buzzing with unusual energy. The overnight crew informed her that Alpha Team had been called back from a training exercise for an emergency briefing. Something big was happening, though nobody was sharing details with the support staff. Sarah went about her morning routine of preparing breakfast service, setting up the steam tables, and ensuring the coffee urns were filled and ready. As the SEALs began filtering in for their meal, Sarah could sense the change in atmosphere. The usual joking and casual conversation was replaced by focused discussions conducted in lowered voices. Morrison appeared with his team, their faces showing the kind of serious concentration that came before important missions. Sarah served them without comment, but she could feel the tension radiating from their table. The morning progressed with an undercurrent of anticipation that even the civilian staff could feel. Radio chatter increased throughout the base, and Sarah noticed more officers than usual moving through the corridors with urgent purpose. Whatever was developing, it was significant enough to put the entire command on heightened alert. Around 10:30, Sarah was restocking the beverage station when she overheard fragments of conversation from Morrison's table. Words like hostage situation and time sensitive caught her attention, though she was careful not to appear to be listening. The SEALs were discussing what sounded like a developing crisis that would require immediate response. Morrison stood up abruptly, ending the conversation with a gesture toward the door. His team followed without question, leaving their breakfast half-finished on the table. Sarah watched them go, noting the purposeful way they moved and the grim expressions on their faces. Whatever they were walking into, it was serious enough to command their full attention. The rest of the morning passed quietly, but Sarah could feel the underlying tension that permeated the base when operations were developing. She went about her duties mechanically, her mind processing the fragments of information she had gathered. Years of living with her grandfather had taught her to read the signs of military preparation, and everything pointed to a major operation unfolding. Lunch service came and went with fewer SEALs than usual in attendance. Sarah learned from one of the other kitchen workers that several teams had been deployed on short notice, though nobody knew the specifics. The base had settled into the kind of focused quiet that preceded action, with everyone understanding their role in supporting whatever mission was developing. As afternoon turned to evening, Sarah was cleaning the prep area when the first reports began filtering through the base communication system. Something had gone wrong with the mission. Radio traffic increased dramatically, and she could see officers moving quickly through the corridors with expressions that spoke of serious complications. Morrison reappeared in the kitchen around 7 p.m., his uniform showing signs of field activity and his face carrying the weight of command decisions. He moved to the coffee station without his usual team, pouring a cup with hands that Sarah noticed were completely steady despite whatever stress he was carrying. Their eyes met across the serving area, and for the first time, Sarah saw him really look at her, as if seeing something he had missed before. The moment passed quickly as Morrison was called away by a communications sergeant, but something had shifted in that brief exchange. Sarah returned to her duties with a growing sense that the routine of her invisible existence was about to change in ways she could not yet imagine. The base around her hummed with the energy of a military machine adapting to unexpected challenges, and she found herself wondering what role, if any, she might play in the events that were clearly still unfolding. As her shift ended and she prepared to leave for the day, Sarah could not shake the feeling that the comfortable anonymity she had maintained for 8 months was about to be tested in ways that would reveal exactly what kind of person she really was underneath the invisible exterior she had carefully constructed. The emergency alarm that shattered the pre-dawn quiet of the naval base was unlike anything Sarah had heard in her 8 months of employment. She was in the early stages of breakfast prep when the klaxon began its urgent wailing, followed immediately by announcements over the base-wide communication system. All non-essential personnel were ordered to secure positions and await further instructions, but the kitchen staff was specifically directed to maintain meal service for operational personnel who might need sustenance during extended operations. Sarah found herself alone in the massive kitchen as the other civilian contractors followed evacuation protocols to designated safe areas. She had volunteered to stay behind, knowing that someone needed to maintain basic services for whatever crisis was unfolding. The base had taken on an atmosphere of controlled urgency that reminded her of storm preparations back home in Montana, when everyone understood their responsibilities and moved with quiet efficiency toward a common goal. Through the serving window that looked out onto the main corridor, Sarah could see teams of armed personnel moving with tactical precision toward various objectives throughout the facility. Their movement spoke of serious threat assessment and response protocols being activated. Whatever had triggered this level of mobilization was significant enough to transform the familiar base into something resembling a war zone. Morrison appeared in the corridor around 6 a.m., leading a mixed group of SEALs and base security personnel toward what Sarah knew was the main communications center. His face carried the kind of focused intensity she had learned to recognize in her grandfather when he talked about combat situations. This was not a training exercise or routine emergency drill. This was the real thing unfolding in real time. The first concrete information came through the base intercom system around 6:30. A hostile force had somehow penetrated the outer perimeter and was attempting to access classified materials housed in the underground storage facilities. The intruders had taken several civilian contractors hostage and were using them as leverage to prevent security forces from mounting an immediate assault. The situation required careful coordination to resolve without casualties among the innocent personnel caught in the middle. Sarah continued her work in the kitchen while processing this information. The storage facilities were located 2 levels below the dining area where she worked, connected by the same tunnel system that allowed her to move supplies throughout the complex. She knew those passages better than most people on the base, having spent months navigating them during her daily routines. The realization that she possessed potentially valuable knowledge about the base layout created an uncomfortable weight in her stomach. Around 7 a.m., Morrison returned to the kitchen area with two of his team members. They were studying blueprints of the lower levels and discussing approach routes that might allow them to reach the hostage situation without alerting the intruders to their presence. Sarah could hear fragments of their conversation from her position behind the serving counter, and she recognized that they were dealing with incomplete information about the tunnel system. The SEALs were planning to approach through what they believed was an abandoned maintenance passage, but Sarah knew that route had been sealed off 3 months earlier during renovations. She had discovered the closure while taking a shortcut to the storage area where she retrieved supplies for the kitchen. The blueprints they were using were outdated, and their planned approach would lead them into a dead end that could compromise the entire mission. For several minutes, Sarah wrestled with the decision of whether to speak up. Her natural inclination was to remain invisible and let the professionals handle their business, but she also understood that lives were at stake. The knowledge she possessed could make the difference between success and failure of their rescue operation. Finally, her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that some situations required people to step forward regardless of their comfort level. Sarah approached Morrison's table with a coffee pot, using the pretense of service to position herself where she could speak without being overheard by others in the area. Her voice was steady but quiet as she informed him that the passage they were planning to use had been sealed during recent construction work. Morrison looked up at her with surprise, not just at the information, but at the fact that a civilian contractor was providing tactical intelligence. The lieutenant commander asked Sarah to explain what she knew about the current state of the tunnel system. She described the alternative routes that remained accessible, including a maintenance corridor that most people did not know existed because it was primarily used for utilities access. This passage would allow the SEALs to approach the storage area from an unexpected direction, potentially giving them the element of surprise they needed to resolve the situation successfully. Morrison made a quick decision to have Sarah accompany them as a guide through the tunnel system. The base security chief initially objected to involving a civilian in what was essentially a combat operation, but Morrison argued that her knowledge could be the difference between success and failure. Time was running short, and they needed every advantage they could get to ensure the safety of the hostages. Sarah was issued basic protective gear and instructed to stay behind the assault team at all times, serving only as a guide to navigate the confusing network of passages beneath the base. As they prepared to move out, she caught Morrison looking at her with an expression that suggested he was seeing her completely differently than he had for the previous 8 months. The invisible kitchen worker was about to become an integral part of a life-or-death mission. The descent into the tunnel system revealed the true complexity of the base's underground infrastructure. Miles of corridors connected various facilities and storage areas, with emergency lighting casting eerie shadows on the concrete walls. Sarah led the way with confident steps, her familiarity with the layout allowing the team to move quickly through areas that would have taken them much longer to navigate without her guidance. They reached the maintenance corridor that Sarah had described, a narrow passage that ran parallel to the main storage facility. Through ventilation grates, they could hear voices from the area where the hostages were being held. The intruders were clearly agitated and discussing their options for escape, with occasional threats directed toward their prisoners that made everyone in the SEAL team tense with controlled anger. Morrison deployed his men into position while Sarah remained in the corridor as instructed. The plan was to create a coordinated distraction that would allow them to breach the storage area and neutralize the threat before the hostages could be harmed. Everything depended on precise timing and the element of surprise that Sarah's route had provided them. The assault began with a carefully orchestrated series of events designed to confuse and disorient the intruders. Lights in the storage area were cut remotely while the SEALs used night vision equipment to maintain their advantage. Sarah could hear the beginning of the operation through the ventilation system, the controlled chaos of professional soldiers executing a plan that had been developed and refined through years of training and experience. What nobody had anticipated was the presence of additional hostiles who had positioned themselves as backup in the very corridor where Sarah was waiting. She became aware of their approach through sounds that her grandfather had taught her to recognize, the careful footsteps of people trying to move without being detected. The SEALs were committed to their assault and could not be warned without compromising the entire operation. Sarah found herself facing a choice that would define everything about who she really was beneath the invisible exterior she had maintained for so long. She could retreat and hope that the situation resolved itself, or she could act on skills and instincts that she had kept hidden for over a decade. The sound of weapons being readied in the darkness made the decision for her. The events of the next few seconds would become the stuff of legend among the SEAL teams, a story that would be told and retold whenever someone questioned the potential that might be hiding within the most unlikely people. In the darkness of the maintenance corridor, Sarah's world narrowed to a single point of absolute clarity. The approaching footsteps belonged to three armed individuals who were positioning themselves to attack the SEAL team from behind while they were engaged in rescuing the hostages. She could hear their whispered communications in a language she did not recognize, but their intent was unmistakably hostile. Morrison and his men were completely focused on the operation ahead of them, unaware of the threat developing behind their position. Sarah had approximately 30 seconds before the attackers would be in position to open fire on the SEALs. The corridor offered limited cover, and any attempt to warn Morrison's team would alert the hostiles to her presence and potentially trigger the very attack she was trying to prevent. In that moment of perfect stillness, every lesson her grandfather had taught her about marksmanship, situational awareness, and making decisions under pressure crystallized into absolute focus. The first attacker rounded the corner just as Sarah had positioned herself behind a utility junction box that provided minimal concealment. He was armed with an assault rifle and moving with the confidence of someone who believed he had tactical advantage. Sarah's hand found the sidearm that Morrison had insisted she carry for emergency protection, a weapon she had hoped never to use, but had instinctively checked and familiarized herself with during their descent into the tunnels. What happened next would later be described by Morrison as the most remarkable display of combat shooting he had witnessed in 20 years of military service. Sarah engaged the first attacker with two precisely placed shots that dropped him instantly. The sound of gunfire in the confined space was deafening, but she had already shifted position and acquired her second target before the echo had faded. Her grandfather's voice guided her through the sequence, reminding her to control her breathing and trust her instincts. The second attacker had superior positioning and better equipment, but Sarah had something he lacked, the kind of natural shooting ability that cannot be taught or manufactured. She engaged him while moving to new cover, placing shots with accuracy that defied the challenging conditions of darkness and stress. Her movements were economical and purposeful, each action designed to maximize her advantage while minimizing her exposure to return fire. The third attacker had witnessed the elimination of his teammates and was attempting to retreat while calling for backup through his radio. Sarah realized that allowing him to escape would compromise the entire rescue operation and potentially endanger everyone on the base. She pursued him through the corridor system with the kind of tactical awareness that suggested capabilities far beyond those of a civilian kitchen worker. The final engagement took place at a junction where multiple passages converged, creating a complex environment with numerous angles of approach and potential cover positions. The attacker had superior firepower and training, but Sarah had home field advantage and an understanding of the terrain that proved decisive. She used the base's infrastructure to her advantage, employing angles and sight lines that her months of navigation had made second nature. When Morrison and his team completed their rescue operation and returned to the corridor, they found Sarah standing calmly among three neutralized threats, her weapon secured, and her demeanor suggesting that extraordinary events had just concluded. The rescued hostages were safe, the original mission was successful, and a secondary threat had been eliminated by someone they had considered a non-combatant just hours earlier. The debriefing that followed revealed the full extent of what had transpired in those crucial minutes. Sarah's actions had prevented a coordinated attack that could have resulted in casualties among the rescue team and potentially allowed the primary hostage situation to escalate beyond control. Her shooting accuracy under combat conditions was remarkable even by SEAL standards, with shot placement that spoke of exceptional training and natural ability. Morrison's initial questioning revealed the depth of Sarah's background that had remained hidden during her months of employment. Her grandfather's military service had included combat in Korea, and his training methods had been thorough and comprehensive. Sarah had competed in precision shooting competitions throughout her teenage years, winning several state-level championships before putting her skills aside to focus on conventional education and career paths. The investigation that followed confirmed that the base had been targeted by a sophisticated hostile force with inside knowledge of security protocols and facility layout. Sarah's intervention had disrupted their operational plan at a critical moment, contributing significantly to the overall success of the counteroperation. Her knowledge of the tunnel system had enabled the rescue, and her combat skills had prevented what could have been a devastating tactical reversal. The formal recognition of Sarah's actions created an unusual situation for military protocol. She was a civilian contractor who had performed at the level of an elite military operator under combat conditions. Morrison recommended her for commendation through civilian channels, but he also began discussions about opportunities for someone with her demonstrated capabilities to contribute more directly to special operations missions. The story of the kitchen worker who had transformed into a deadly accurate marksman in seconds became legendary within the special operations community. SEALs who had barely acknowledged Sarah's existence for 8 months now looked at her with the kind of respect reserved for proven warriors. The invisible woman had revealed herself to be anything but ordinary when circumstances demanded extraordinary performance. Sarah found herself facing choices about her future that she had never imagined possible. The skills she had inherited from her grandfather and refined through years of practice had suddenly opened doors to a world she had observed from the outside, but never considered joining. Morrison and his superiors were interested in exploring whether she might be suited for roles that would utilize her unique combination of capabilities and base knowledge. The transformation was not just professional, but personal as well. Sarah had discovered aspects of herself that had been dormant for years, capabilities that emerged naturally when lives were at stake and decisive action was required. The quiet confidence that had always been part of her character was now reinforced by the knowledge that she could perform under pressure when it mattered most. In the weeks that followed, Sarah continued her kitchen duties while considering offers that would represent a complete change in her life direction. The SEALs who passed through her serving line now engaged her in conversations that revealed their respect for her demonstrated abilities. Morrison made a point of discussing various aspects of special operations work, clearly evaluating her interest and potential for more advanced roles. The base itself felt different to Sarah now that she had seen it from the perspective of someone who had contributed to its security rather than simply working within its routines. She understood the larger purpose that connected all the individual roles and responsibilities from kitchen operations to combat missions. Her place in that larger picture had fundamentally shifted from support personnel to someone whose capabilities were recognized and valued. The most significant change was in how Sarah saw herself. The skills her grandfather had taught her were no longer just memories from childhood, but proven abilities that had made a difference when it mattered most. The confidence she felt was not arrogance, but the quiet assurance that comes from knowing you can rise to meet challenges that would intimidate others. She had discovered that the person she really was had been there all along, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. The story of that day became part of SEAL team folklore, told and retold whenever new operators needed examples of how extraordinary capabilities can be found in the most unexpected places. Morrison would conclude these stories by emphasizing that the most important lesson was never to underestimate the people around you, because you never know who might be the person you need when everything is on the line. For Sarah, the events had revealed a truth about herself that would guide all her future decisions. She was not meant to be invisible, not meant to blend into the background and watch others take action. She was meant to be the person who stepped forward when stepping forward was needed, who used her abilities to make a difference when differences needed to be made. The kitchen had been just the beginning of a story that was far from over.